Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in The Analogy of Religion by Joseph Butler, first published in 1736 as a Christian philosophical apologetics. We're going to take a look at Chapter 1. We've completed our introduction. We're going to take a look at Chapter 1 and the analogy of consciousness. The analogy of consciousness. Let's take a look at Block 1. We're going to take a look at the self as living agent. And under Note 1, the self as living agent, human consciousness is a single and indivisible power. The capacities of the living agent consist of the fact that action and the awareness of acting, happiness and the awareness of enjoyment, misery and the awareness of suffering, those are the three capacities of the living agent. The general living faculties are those of perception and action. And that is what constitutes a living agent for Joseph Butler. Then he brings up the concept of continuance. The living capacities will continue after death. Death in itself is not knowable. We only know the effects of death. Reason itself dictates that there is no connection between the living capacities and death. The self's existence as living agent will continue according to providential conduct. And then he takes up the concept of finite bodies. The finite body is not a part of our living agent self, and the dissolution of the body does not destroy, does not deprive the living faculties of the living agent. The effects of death do not imply the destruction of the living agent, period. All of this is from the point of view of natural religion. Let's move on to Block 2 and take a look at the self and this concept of continuance. And Butler gives us three axioms of continuance. 1. There is no way to determine through experience the concept of living being. 2. There is no support for the notion that there is an internal system of matter that constitutes the self. And 3. There's no support for the notion that systems of matter at death result in the destruction of the living agent. If you notice axiom number 2, he's saying that neurophysiological correlates of consciousness do not constitute consciousness. Consciousness is not equated with the brain. It is not equated with the brain. Correlates of consciousness do not equal consciousness. Then a note 2, the concept of adventitious matter. The organs of sense simply prepare and convey objects for the living agent. The organs of sense and the limbs of motion are simply instruments employed by the living agent. So, we've looked at the concept of living agent, we've looked at the concept of continuance. Now we're going to look at the self and its states in Block 3. The general laws of cosmic economy are as follows. Selves are endued with capacities for virtue and religion and do not actualize these capacities until after infancy and after childhood. 2. The economy of the universe also might require living creatures without these capacities. And then we look at the concepts of reason, memory, and affection. These powers do not depend on the finite body. The self exists in two states of life and perception as follows. Each has its own laws, its own enjoyments, its own sufferings. First, there is a state of sensation, and second, there is a state of reflection. So there are two states of life and perception. The state of sensation, the state of reflection. Now, under the state of reflection, the relation of the finite body to the state of reflection is not a necessity. This again supports the notion of continuance. Therefore, the notion of a posthumous life implies going on or continuance rather than beginning entirely anew. But from here, after looking at the concepts of living agent, continuance, and state of reflection, we now look at future state, the self and future state in column 4. reason does not reveal to us our future state after death. Continuance only applies to the living agent as a perceiving and acting living agent. Continuance depends on the same subject upon which the whole frame of nature depends. That which is natural necessarily requires an intelligent agent to render it so. This in turn necessitates the notion of the dispensations of providence. The credibility of the future life requires that the doctrine of religion address the general evidence for the whole of creation. So under this beginning in natural religion, Butler begins by defining four essential concepts. The concept of living agent, the concept of continuance, the concept of state of reflection, and the concept of future state. And that really is our recall, our quad recall is four concepts: living agent, continuance, state of reflection, and future state. So that really does give us a synopsis of Chapter 1. Chapter 1 runs from page 5 to page 21, and we will pick up Chapter 2 beginning with page 22. But this all came out in 1736. Now the edition we're working off of is a 1906 edition of the Analogy of Religion, but it was first published in 1736. It's an 18th century Christian philosophical apologetics, and it is considered a most important scholarly work of Christian philosophy. It's considered one of the most important Christian scholastic works ever. It's part of the Select Scholar series. But it is first published in 1736. It's an 18th century Christian philosophical apologetics. But the first half of the book is natural religion, and the second half is revealed religion. So he begins with natural religion, and he begins with the analogy of consciousness. He begins with consciousness considered from phenomenology, considered from the analogy of consciousness in natural religion. So he begins with phenomenology. He begins with a phenomenology, which is, it's kind of ironic that this is what he was doing in the 18th century, and we're just now really giving rebirth to phenomenology in the 21st century. So we've got the French rereading Hegel and writing new phenomenologies like Alexander Kojève. And so these new phenomenologies are surfacing now. And here we look back to a phenomenology of apologetics in the 18th century. So it's coming full circle. We're very much today in the scholastic world looking at the French rereading and rewriting of Hegel. We're looking at new phenomenologies coming out of scholars like Alexander Kojève and many others. But we have to appreciate the depth of content and the great argument and defense of Christian apologetics by Butler here in Chapter 1. He begins with the analogy of consciousness. We can recall this lesson through four concepts: living agent, continuance, state of reflection, and future state. Those are the recall concepts for the lesson. He begins with wanting to really define the living agent as an agent that possesses action and the awareness of that action, happiness and the awareness of enjoyment, misery and the conscious awareness of suffering. So he does emphasize self-consciousness, but it all centers on perception and action. And for Butler, finitude cannot constrain, destroy the living capacities of the living agent. Therefore, continuance becomes a propositional notion for him. But this gives us a tremendous look at Chapter 1, and it is something we have to look at small segments at a time. We don't want to skim over this material. There's a lot of depth of content in every lesson that Butler teaches here. I mean, the introduction had a great deal of content, and Chapter 1 shows us a tremendous lesson, but that'll give us our quad recall of living agent, continuance, state of reflection, and future state. And we will be able to pick up next time with Chapter 2, which begins on page 22. We've had our introduction now. We've had our Chapter 1. We are firmly launched into natural religion and the positing and reflective analysis and analogy of natural religion. We'll pick up with Chapter 2 next time.